Hey, there he is. Henry Jenkins has arrived, folks. That's great. And then here on the left-hand screen is our host for the next 45 minutes of our lives, Simon Pulman from Starlight Runner Entertainment. So I'm just going to turn over to Simon and say, Simon, over to you. But really, all you folks here in the audience, stay glued to your seats because this is going to be a great discussion about spreadable media. So Simon, please, take it away.
Since he's up on the screen, let's just give Henry a wave from everybody. Okay. So while the judges are making a decision, can we hear Henry? I'll intro him anyway. While the judges are making a decision, we have a real honour here. Henry Jenkins is arguably the world's foremost media scholar. His 2006 book, Convergence, Culture remains essential reading for anybody working in new media, or what we've come to know as transmedia. What I love about it particularly is what was alluded to there, is that Henry identified and anticipated behavioural trends, particularly around fan culture, that we're now seeing come into mainstream prominence 5 years later. Amazing stuff, really. Now Henry and his collaborators Sam Ford and Joshua Green are coming back with a new book, Spreadable Media, which is coming out next year. I've been fortunate enough to read the manuscript, and I can tell you that as soon as it appears on Amazon for pre-order, you should click that button. Henry is also USC's Provost Professor of Communication, Journalism and Cinematic Arts, and is currently leading a class on transmedia storytelling at USC. Right now we have the enormous honour of talking to Henry about the book and what he perceives as forthcoming trends in media and entertainment. The way we're doing this for questions is, I think, some papers being passed around, so pass it down like a note in class. Anyway, let's welcome Henry again, please. So, Henry, tell us a little bit about the concept of spreadable media. What's changed since you wrote Convergence Culture, and why are the notions within the book so important right now?
Well, I think, like any book, as soon as it comes out, it's already out of date, because we're trying to capture a moment of profound and prolonged transition in our relationship to media, and the change is very rapid. So between the time when that book Convergence Culture went to print and when it came out, Web 2.0 was coined as a concept by Tim O'Reilly. So there's virtually no discussion of that in the book. Social media in 2005, when I finished the book, was just beginning to be on the rise. Second Life has come and gone since the book came out. YouTube was scarcely on the horizon. Twitter was but a twinkle in someone's eyes at the time that the book was being written. So there's been an explosion of social media which have had an enormous impact on the ways we consume, produce, and circulate media. So part of what Spreadable Media tries to do is continue the story I began in Convergence Culture and try to describe what happens as our culture becomes more participatory, as more and more people have the capacity to take media in their own hands, and how that changes other aspects of the way media operates. And in this case, while Convergence Culture is still very much interested in consumer control over production and reception, this book is really about consumer control over circulation. And so we start with this distinction between distribution and circulation. Distribution is top-down, it's corporate control, it's tightly regulated, it's the practices of broadcasting as we've known it throughout the 20th century. Circulation is hybrid. It's partially top-down, but it's also partially bottom-up. It's partially controlled by consumers who are making a whole set of decisions, both authorized and unauthorized, which are impacting the way media circulates through the culture. So what I'm interested in when I talk about media spreadability is how does media spread, and how do we play an active role in shaping the system of circulation as it currently exists. The word spreadable was intended to be contrast with the term sticky. So the term sticky, which we used for most of the last decade to talk about media, was really about how do we lock down content and lock down attention? How do we create what I think of as a Roach Motel model of media, right? That you suck people in and you grab them and you hold them and you don't let them go, and you monetize their attention for as long as until they can find the back button to get the hell out of Dodge, right? Spreadability is really a world where if it doesn't spread, it's dead. And we can sort of see a company like Amazon is at the cusp between these two things, because Amazon creates a set of lists on its site which are intended to grab our attention and hold it there and get us to look at as many books as possible before we leave. But Amazon's associate program has long supported bloggers who want to link to Amazon and talk about their books. And if you follow those links back, Amazon gives a percentage of sale to the blogger. So it's decided to put itself out in the conversations where the public is. And that's a set of practices around spreadability. How do we move and disperse the attention to those spaces where communities are already talking about things that are important? So when we talk, the notion of brand communities sort of grows out of this idea that we can attract a community. What I want to suggest is communities are out there, and what you have to do is court multiple communities who may have interest related to your brand or your media property. And by going out and engaging with those communities where they're located, whether it's on a Facebook page or a YouTube channel or wherever, being able to be portable, to be embeddable, to be movable, changes the dynamic and allows the consumer to be an active advocate for you, but also allows your materials to become a resource for the conversations consumers may already be having.
Now, Henry, one thing we often hear in the mass media is this desire to have something go viral. Why is the term spreadable media preferable to this existing notion of virality?
Well, if stickiness is a Roach Motel model, viral media is a smallpox-infected blanket theory of media circulation, right? The central idea is that someone designs a killer virus, it infects the human host, and the human host unknowingly carries it back to the village where he continues to infect friends and family, right? The notion of viral media is one that allows almost no agency. It's associated with notions of irrationality, addiction, unknowing circulation, and it functions in the industry in one of two ways. It is either the industry develops these experts or so-called experts who claim to have access to arcane knowledge. I know how to make your content go viral. Or it's the notion, or the other notion is, I have no idea what just happened. It just went viral. Right? And both of those mean that we have no real way of explaining the agency of consumers and actively choosing what media to circulate. And in a world where there's so many media options and we engage in so many acts of grassroots circulation, we are making decisions all the time about what media we pay attention to, what media we circulate, which groups we circulate it to, which networks and tools we use to circulate, what messages we attach to it, what conversations we embed it. And all of those decisions require us to assume a rational consumer, a rational citizen and participant who is making decisions about spreading media. And so moving from viral media to spreadable media allows us to pay attention to the processes that shape the spread of media, and thus to and acknowledge the fact that culture is now self-replicating, which is another underlying assumption of viral media metaphors, but that we as humans create cultures to serve our own interest. And so it's about, let's understand what the cultural reasons are for why media circulates the way that it does.
Well, you've just anticipated my next question. That was something that really resonated with me in the book, was the notion that the explanation that when people share content, they're saying something about themselves, or perhaps they're trying to forge a bond with the rest of the community. Can you talk a little bit about that? We saw actually in a presentation from YouTube yesterday a little bit of that notion. So if you could explain it, and also perhaps make suggestions, if it's possible, on how producers can leverage that power.
Right, so I think the essence of it is to recognize that where to start. I guess I would say one of the things we use in the book to talk about this is the notion of a gift economy, and this is an idea that comes out of anthropology, and it sort of suggests that in a gift economy, people give gifts to each other in order to facilitate social ends and cultural needs. That is, gift giving is is tied to logics of social reciprocity, of expressing emotional bonds. So when I give you a gift, it's not the gift, something is taking place which changes a commodity I bought in the store into a gift that I give to you as a token of our affection, our friendship, our esteem, and so forth. So when I buy a bottle at the wine shop, I'm involved in a transaction as a commodity. I've bought something, I've paid money. The shop clerk doesn't owe me anything other than the bottle of wine I paid for. I don't have any social relation to the shopkeeper. It's a commodity. I take it home. What do? I take the price tag off. And when I take the price tag off, I'm involved in this magical moment where the commodity begins to move out of a regime of value and into a regime of meaning. It is when I remove the price tag and then bring it to a party, it's no longer about what I paid for the bottle of wine, except insofar as that speaks to the value I place on the emotional and social relationships of the party. And when I give it to my host, it's a gesture of friendship. So if we think our media in that way, what we're saying is that media may be produced for a range of reasons, economic reasons, artistic reasons, political reasons. But for it to circulate, it has to change from a commodity into a gift. It has to change from something that was produced in a regime of value into something that's circulated in a regime of meaning. So that as I change it, remove the price tag in effect, and give it to someone else, it's no longer just about what you meant it to be, but it's about what I mean it to be, what it says about me, what it says about the relationship, what it says about the act of communication that I'm involved with. So it's about, so as you think as a producer of media, what you're trying to do is make it easy for people to turn your commodity into a gift, to turn what you created into a resource which they can use for their communication. And as that takes place, then in fact, your message, your goals are carried along with it as it reaches this new destination. So here in the States, we've been watching very closely Occupy Wall Street. And Occupy Wall Street is an incredible example of the spreadable media principles in practice. So I would argue, there's a lot of pressure. What's the message? What's the demand of the Occupy movement? And I think that's to misunderstand what this is, because I would argue that Occupy is not a movement, it's a provocation. It's a provocation for discussion. It's a machine that drives people to talk about issues of economic equality, economic opportunity in the United States. And it's generated a massive amount of communication around it by producing a set of highly visible, highly potent images, sounds, text, which circulate beyond the event itself. So that every day we're receiving here photographs of really remarkable appropriations of popular culture that are being linked to the cause. Which of the superheroes are the 1%? Uncle Scrooge and Richie Rich as the 1%. The Lancasters from Game of Thrones as the 1%. The use of zombies, the use of, all kinds of pop culture iconography to anchor this message and get it in a way that's catchy, that's engaging, that can be circulated on YouTube, that can be circulated through Twitter, that can be circulated through social networking sites. The ability of a kind of decentralized movement to generate a constant stream of images that people want to share with each other. And I think there's an enormous amount, oddly enough, that capitalism could learn by studying Occupy about the ways in which any message needs to be built in order to be spread and in order to people to feel a sense of enfranchisement. Because I think it is this machine, this provocation for dialogue is why Occupy has moved from relatively media silence to being the central topic of conversation for people all over the United States in the last month.
Absolutely incredible answer, Henry. Amazing. I'll just compose myself for a second. So in both the narrative and non-narrative context, we have this content that's spreading in the book. You talk about everything from politics to Susan Boyle. One thing that was mentioned in an earlier panel is that Nielsen ratings and traditional metrics for gathering this information and understanding it don't necessarily suffice for capturing what audiences are actually doing. Can you talk a little bit about how we might be able to better quantify those kinds of audience habits and their value to producers, please?
Well, this goes back to something I talked a little bit about in convergence culture, is we have to move from a logic of impressions to a logic of expressions. That is, impressions is the language that Nielsen's based on, how many eyeballs saw the content. But it tells us nothing about how meaningful that content was, how generative it was, the acts of communication that occur around it. So expressions as a concept invites us to look at what are people doing with content, where are they talking about it, how are they mobilizing it, how are they moving it forward. And there have been, since the book Convergence Culture came out, there's been the rise of buzzmetrics, there's the rise of a variety of different mechanisms for measuring conversation. My colleagues at the Annenberg Innovation Lab have been really working on ways of tracking Twitter to anticipate box office returns for Hollywood films as they open. But they're also using it to anticipate the next Arab Spring uprising based on Twitter feeds out of the Middle East. So these tools are allowing us to measure certain things. Robert Kuznets at York University talks about netography and basically suggesting that companies do large-scale searches of the web to get a sense of the range of uses and meanings people are making of their materials, not with the goal of shutting them down and sending cease and desist letters, but using that as a research method to understand the existing fan base, the existing communities that are talking about them, the potential uses people are making of those products, and the kinds of meanings that are emerging. Before you build an ad that reshapes some of the meaning of a product, maybe you need to know what it means to people in the first place. And this is a much more powerful methodology than sort of small-scale focus groups. So all of these point to mechanisms by which we can tap into and better understand acts of meaning production and cultural circulation.
On that note, I just want you to quickly, if you can, explain something you talk about in the book, which is the distinction between hearing and listening as a metaphor for brands and other companies.
Yeah, anyone who's got an adolescent child knows the difference between hearing and listening, right? You're having a conversation. You say, "Are you listening to me?" And the child rolls his eyes and says, yeah. And even if the child could repeat back the last thing you said to them, you really are not convinced they've listened to you. They've physically heard you, but they haven't actively engaged in an active communication. So companies often use what my co-author Sam Ford called hearing aids, that is ways of collecting data on their consumers, but they're not actually listening to the consumer in any way that's meaningful, that involves a give and take, that involves communication in both directions, that involves actually putting what's said in any sort of meaningful context, that tries to go beyond whatever questions they've already formulated and asked. This is the problem, that in an age of spreadable media, there's an enormous amount of insight you can gain about whoever the people who are consuming your media products, your brands, your advertisements, if you actually actively engage in a more in-depth approach, an ethnographic approach to understanding how this media travels through the culture.
Thank you. The title of this talk is Gazing into the Crystal Ball, so we'd better get some predictions for the future. As we discussed in our earlier phone conversation, it might make a little bit of sense to maybe segment this out between the sort of the marketing, communications end, the big IP, the studio stuff, the blockbusters, and perhaps most interestingly right now, given what Lance was talking about yesterday and some other people, the independent space. Where do you think we're going over the next 2 to 3 years, and where do you see really big opportunities that people can get in there?
Well, maybe the place to start is that independent space, because I think that's where the real dramatic change is going to take place. That independent artists have more motives to change the current structure of how media gets distributed and how we develop business models around media than do the major players, right? They dominate the old system of distribution. They will be forced to change in some ways by the emerging systems that we're talking about of circulation, but they're going to be slower to change. So right now, if you look across the independent sector, on the one hand, there's more opportunity to get your media out than at any point in human history. On the other, there are more challenges in reaching the attention of any given consumer than in an old system of distribution. So in a distribution system, the independent filmmaker knocks on the door, gets a meeting with Miramax, maybe Miramax picks it out. If Miramax picks it out and puts some brand power behind it, you have the potential to draw X number of eyeballs into the movie theater and watch it. Let's imagine an independent system that's totally independent of that. You start from the very beginning of conceptualization, reaching out and courting the consumers that are going to be invested in your product. It could, if you're Lance Weiler and you do low-budget horror films, you're looking at horror buffs. If you're an activist, like say Brave New Films, and you're looking for progressives, you're looking for people who are critics of capitalism. You're looking for minorities. If you're a minority filmmaker, you're an Asian American filmmaker, you're looking for Asian Americans. You've got to figure out who those people are. You want to begin to court and engage with those people from the very, very beginning. And here's where something like Kickstarter strikes me as very, very interesting. That even when it's just conceptualized, Kickstarter is allowing people to buy into an independent property and to invest in it with real money and real time. So we imagine a property starts at Kickstarter. There are now all these incredible examples of crowdsourcing going on. So that not only, once you've started to fund the film, you may court your audience to provide labor. They may actually, in the case of a film like Lost Zombies, where people are shooting footage and sending it into a central location to produce a fiction film about zombies, that Lost Zombies, the footage comes from the audience. Other companies are seeking props or skills the audience might have, locations they might have. So there are many, many ways to involve people in the production process. As you start to come out the other end of that, you're then in a situation where you can court the audience for distribution. So Brave New Films did house parties and used Netflix to distribute DVDs of their work, and people would organize house parties, invite their friends over, watch the movie, discuss the movie, and it's embedded in a context. A company like FilmSprout is trying to identify many different routes of independent films and documentaries to reach their desired audience through building fan relationships or community relationships around them. So in theory, now while I have found no example of a film that does all three of those things, in theory you could have a film that from conception through distribution was shaped by building strong social relations between producers and consumers. And that, I think, helps independent filmmaker potentially get around an awful lot of the gatekeepers who currently block access to the market. It doesn't guarantee success. It's still an uphill struggle. But it does mean that there's an ability to really forge a strong alliance with the community as we move forward. So that's a set of ideas about the independent sector. I think we're going to go there. I think as we look at television producers, I've been pushing for some time, and I keep thinking we're getting closer to the idea of viewer-supported television in a very real, tangible sense. I thought we were going to get there when Josh Whedon did Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog and seemed to produce low-budget content that developed a cult following that looked like it could be self-supporting and self-sustaining. But I want to predict that before much longer, someone like a Josh Whedon, a J.J. Abrams, will take the step of either producing a new cult media, niche media property and selling it directly to the audience without going through the networks as a gatekeeper. We can sort of see gestures in that line with the Guild or Legion of Extraordinary Dancers, which also point to niche content that's developing pretty strong following on the web. So the idea that just as I buy a magazine subscription and I pay in advance for 50 issues of Entertainment Weekly, and they then make the issues, I could pay in advance for the production of the television show, and the show content would be produced and supported by me. That, I think, is a direction that the current system of social media could easily support, especially coupled with iTunes or some other delivery platform, and would give us the ability to have more television that served niche interest and reflected diverse values than the current system that we got. It won't break the back of broadcasting. I think we're stuck with broadcasting for the foreseeable future, but I think it will create more alternatives for us to consume media that more perfectly reflects our own taste and interest. And I think certainly paves the way for shows that are sort of start off, have a very steep fan commitment, but very narrow one to move forward. And so when you look at someone like Joss Whedon, who has real difficulty sustaining a network show, yet has an incredible base of support, deeply loyal to them, that will buy almost anything he produces, I don't understand why Whedon continues to work in broadcast television as it's currently constituted, rather than forging really strong alliances with his consumers.
Okay, I'm going to revisit some of those points, but I want to go to some questions from the audience, please. First from Catalina. In the mid-90s, Henry, she says, I read one of your books. It was about TV fandom and participatory culture. That was almost 15 years ago, if not more. How do you feel when seeing on this transmedia, gamification, Web 2.0, social web, after all these things that you've been seeing and analyzing and announcing, how do you feel when it comes to the mainstream now and everyone's sort of owning these concepts for themselves and using them to potentially make a lot of money?
Well, I'm thrilled. I mean, my goal I coined the term participatory culture almost 25 years ago, at a time that I was talking about videotape machines and photocopy machines as the central mechanisms of grassroots participation. But I was actually talking about a phenomenon that is more than 150 years old, of everyday people taking media in their own hands and seeking to shape the means of cultural production and cultural circulation. This is a struggle people have been involved with for a long time. So as it gains foothold, as we develop, we lower the cost of production, we lower the cost of circulation, people acquire skills and literacies about deploying this, we develop grassroots institutions that support it. This is all very, very exciting. Where I'm concerned is the blurring of the lines in people's minds between participatory culture and Web 2.0. That for me, Web 2.0 is a business model. Participatory culture is a cultural movement, right? They're very different things. And Web 2.0 as a business model seeks to capture and commodify participation in ways that serve the interest of the companies that are involved. In doing so, it may push participatory culture content and practices to larger and larger publics. And I don't think one just walks away from YouTube just because Google's making money off of YouTube or trying to make money off YouTube. But I don't think that you simply sit back and say that's all we're going to get is a corporately controlled model of participatory culture. When I advocate for participatory culture, I'm advocating for grassroots control of media and communication in the service of diversifying, democratizing our culture. That process plays itself out through any and every available tool. If it needs to play itself out through a corporately controlled platform, it will do so. If there are alternatives available to it, it will play itself out there. In the same sense that when say, we talk about the coffee houses of 18th century Europe as a public sphere, we are describing a space that for the people involved in those public conversations was neither commercial, neither workplace nor home, but was in a commercial establishment which made money off of their communication acts, but nevertheless was a space they could use to engage in public dialogue. And I think of Twitter and I think of YouTube in the same way that I think of the coffee houses. Someone made money by selling those cups of coffee to the people who were debating the Declaration of Independence, but it didn't prevent them from having those conversations. And so the questions are, in what ways do Web 2.0 companies damage participatory culture, constrain it, prevent it from having the conversation it needs to have, and in what ways does it facilitate it? And that's the discussion we should be having as we think about what's happened as this stuff has gone mainstream.
Well, I have a couple of follow-up questions to that from a business perspective. The first, I have to ask you your thoughts on the new evolved form of the Protect IP Act as it's going through the political system.
I'm not sure. I don't know it by that name. So.
Okay. Well, efforts to control copyrighted content outside the United States and so on.
Okay. So yeah, I think I'm frustrated by the fact that the American government has helped try to ramrod its own copyright laws in the countries around the world, because I think the American government has generally moved away from the protection, the balance that was there in the original Constitution. That I believe there ought to be a balance between copyright and fair use, and that right now that there should be a very large space called the public domain, where a significant amount of our cultural materials come to rest quite quickly. And that's a balance that's been disrupted in the last 100 years by policies that are designed to protect. Lawrence Lessig calls them the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, because the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, if you look at the duration of U.S. copyright, it's the age of Mickey Mouse plus 25 years. So as Lessig puts it, Disney, no one ever does to Disney what Disney did to the Brothers Grimm. And I think that's a serious problem. That at a time when more and more of us are seeking to participate in our culture and mobilizing the images that matter in the culture, we should have shorter and shorter durations of copyright. We should have greater protection of fair use, and we should, have practices which acknowledge the value that's created by some forms of unauthorized circulation. It doesn't mean you totally give away the candy shop. It doesn't mean you destroy the economic base of cultural production. But it means we negotiate a new set of relations between copyright holders and copyright users that reflect the reality of a more participatory culture. The social historian E.P. Thompson talks about this as a moral economy. What he describes as an underlying economic system of exchange, there's a moral system, a social system, that's based on notions like trust. So before you and I can trade, we have to actually establish trust with each other. What Thompson tells us is anytime there's a profound disruption of the economic and technological infrastructure, the moral contract, the underlying social contract, the moral economy goes into crisis and goes through a process of legitimization, which competing parties make bids about what they want the new system to be. That's where we're at with copyright right now across the board. That is, new technologies and new cultural practices and new economic practices disrupted the old regime. And now we're trying to figure out what's a fair system for everyone involved. And so we simultaneously see a crisis in copyright and a crisis in fair use. We have one party talking about piracy as theft, and another party talking about sharing as caring. And those slogans sort of represent a set of pushes and pulls that are going on as we as a culture renegotiate our moral contract. But I will say, if the law rigidifies that, if the law sort of locks down a version of copyright that is as extreme as the current American system of copyright and makes that the global norm, it's going to make it much harder to build an actual moral contract rather than a set of enforced relationships between producers and consumers, because the law is out of touch with people's practices and values, and it's being broken by more and more people as they seek what are perfectly reasonable relationships to media producers and media content.
Now, you've talked about how everybody now wants to become a participant in the conversation through sharing and through discussing around media, but something you talk about in the book is the problem of unequal participation, the digital divide, and so forth. Can you go into that a little bit and perhaps describe some ways that might be mitigated?
Yeah, so I mean, we can start with the fact that for most of the last 20 years, we've talked about the digital divide, which is about access to technology. So I can't speak to the Canadian situation, but in the U.S., what we now know is that most Americans have some access to network computing through schools and public libraries, if not through their own technology. The digital divide, though, was the tip of an iceberg, because behind that is what we call the participation gap. And the participation gap is about access to skills, knowledge, cultural resources, social capital, which enables people to meaningfully participate in the cultural practices and political practices of their society. And this is something that is much more intractable, much more difficult for us to deal with. So that the difference between having 20 minutes of access in a school library and having unlimited wireless access is still a technical problem, but it's tied to problems about how do you understand what it is to participate. How do you, what do you understand? How much do kids understand the mechanisms of Facebook or Wikipedia? To what degree do they know how to navigate through a virtual world or to participate in an online community? What are the ethical standards that allows them to meaningfully engage in this space? So Howard Gardner's team at Harvard, the Good Play Project, found that most young people lack a mentor, an adult, a more mature person who knows their way through digital environments and can help them navigate these uncertain spaces, these spaces in transition. The only places that are going to be capable of really responding to that are public institutions, right? A lot of my friends are frustrated with public education, as am I, and you often hear a language of let's blow up the school. But right now, the only place that touches the lives of large numbers of people are schools, public libraries, museums, other institutions which are in the cause of public service. And so what we have to do is fight for those spaces, the spaces where we can instruct people in how to successfully engage in these practices of participatory culture. So what I've seen in a North American context is we've wired the classroom and disabled the computers. So in our schools, the computers have mandatory filters. They've blocked social network sites and blogging tools and microblogging tools. They're discouraging the use of Wikipedia. They've blocked YouTube from use in the classroom. So the teacher is sitting there with this expensive set of equipment at school that's theoretically supposed to equalize access to technology, but they can't do any of the things that represent the new participatory cultures that we've been talking about using those technologies. And what we really need to do is train those teachers to be educators, to be coaches, to be guides, to help young people move into those spaces, take advantage of those resources, engage with those opportunities, and navigate around the risks that they represent. And we want teachers to be part of it. So I've been working with the LA Unified School District to develop some teacher training programs to help teachers become more effective and incorporating those practices into their education. And we're working with a school that serves the poorest of the poor of LA. It's mostly an Hispanic community, mostly low income, heavily undocumented youth. And we're trying to help work with teachers there to help those kids gain access, greater access to the technology, but even more importantly, greater opportunities to participate.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much. I'm going to go to another fan question. It is a fan question. Another audience question. Can you speak to the tendency for companies looking for more interactivity to characterize their audiences as not already being fans in a cultural group sense, and thus approach engagement as though no fanish engagement structure already exists, separate from specific IPs?
Well, as I said, I think rather than thinking of creating a community, companies need to think of courting a community. So whether we're going to call those communities fans or communities of interest or consumers or users, that there is no product that exists in a vacuum. There's no media property that doesn't exist in a genre that people haven't already sorted out their relationship to. There's no consumer good that doesn't exist in a category that hasn't existed over an extended period of time. So I know the research that Saturn had talked for a long time about building a brand community around its car, but in fact what it's doing is what it did was court a community of motorists, and we could take motor clubs back to the late 19th century. As long as we have cars, we had communities of people who called themselves motorists and were deeply involved in the culture of the automobile. So for a period of time, Saturn developed a pitch that appealed to people who wanted to see driving as a social activity, wanted to drive within a community, and they framed their message in a way that was consistent with the ongoing conversations of that community. If I'm producing a new show or a new film, what I want to do is figure out who would be interested and who's invested in conversations around that property. And I need to begin with an ethnographic understanding of who that community is, what their desires are, what they're talking about, and find ways to insert my materials into that conversation. So I don't think you can start with the assumption that there's no participatory, that there's no fans, that there's no engagement. I don't think that makes a lot of sense, because we are, in the course of our lives, engaged in many conversations, in many communities, and there are no disinterested consumers in the contemporary landscape. They may not be fans in the narrow sense of being organized, self-identifying, fan fiction writing, whatever, but they have a position, they have a stake, they have a passion that drives their relationship with the culture around them. And unless you respect it, you're going to lose them.
Okay, Henry, I have to say this has been absolutely amazing. We could probably speak for another couple of hours, and it would just be so enlightening. So thank you very much. I hope the audience has got the impression that they should buy the book next year. I have one final question for you. And unlike the questions that have been asked previously, there's only one correct answer to this question. So here it is. It's from Christine Lim Leboisier. Will you come to Vancouver to keynote merging media next year?
We can work on it. I'd love to be there. It's been a long time since I've been in Vancouver, and I love your city and have a lot of friends there. So let's get the date to me as soon as possible, and let's see what we can make happen.
That sounded like a yes to me. I can tell you this is my first time here. It's been absolutely wonderful, the city and the conference. So seriously consider it, okay? You're going to come, Henry, basically, is what I'm telling you. All right, thank you so much. Well, everybody, once again, please thank Henry Jenkins. Wonderful.